5, 4, 3, 2, and cue.
Hello. Can I ask your full name?
Yes, my name is Stephanie Fan.
And can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I grew up in Boston's Chinatown and have stayed in the Boston area. I've been involved in a variety of organizations here in the city of Boston, including the Boston Chinatown Neighborhood Center and the Chinese Historical Society predominantly. And I also used to teach in the Boston Public Schools.
Okay. And can you tell us why you joined those organizations? The ones you mentioned?
Why I joined them? Well, actually one of them I founded with a group of other people from the community. And there was a couple of people who were working at the hospital down the street at Tufts Medical Center. At the time it was known as New England Medical Center. And they the hospital had been engaged to help in the planning of a community school. And this was a new concept in the 60s and early 70s, to have a school that was going to be a community-based school. So these two people who actually also have Chinatown ties said, well, if this is a community school, why are there no Chinese people involved? Why are there no people from the community involved? So they started their rebel rousing by calling people up and saying, do you know that the hospital is working on this along with Tufts and the city of Boston? And so we started meeting, and I ended up being the first employee of the organization that is now known as the Boston Chinatown Neighborhood Center, with a budget of like $4 million. So it was just very exciting to do that. But those early days, it was very, very tough to get the city to acknowledge that community people could have a voice, that our voices mattered, that our feelings mattered in terms of what we wanted in a community school. So the community school is a concept where the building would be accessible to the community. Because when I was going to the Boston Public Schools, it's like you go in there, you go to school, the end of the day you leave, and that school is shuttered, and then it's not open again until the next day. So having a community school meant you keep the gym open so that people can go in and use it. And people can go in and learn, they can use the library there. And so it's worked out somewhat like that, but not quite. But there are a number of community schools in the city of Boston. And so what happened is that as the organization developed, the organization said, okay, we're going to try some of this programming and see how this programming works. And then if they work, then we can definitely incorporate them into this community school. So we started like daycare programs and language programs to help people in the community learn the language. It was also an organization that brought together three communities: the Chinatown community, the South End community, and the Bay Village community. So there were like three languages involved with our constituents. It was English, Chinese, and Spanish.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Are there similarities between your professional work and the work of the organizations that you mentioned?
Well, I'm no longer working. I'm retired now. So what is it that you wanted to know? What is the what?
The similarities between like your professional work and the work of the organizations, or were they like combined?
Oh, they're the same.
Okay.
Whatever I do. And actually, those of us who were working in the Boston Public Schools, so in the 70s and 80s, the bilingual programs in the city were quite new. And the school establishment was not quite used to having these programs. So there were very few people in the Boston Public Schools who could speak a second language. So they ended up hiring people like myself and others who could speak Spanish, could speak Creole, could speak Cape Verdean Portuguese, and I think there were, and Spanish, of course. And so we worked as a team, and most of us were young teachers. We were not part of the Boston school establishment. So we wanted to do all these things, and our hearts were really with the community and not with the school department. We felt our loyalty was with the community folks. And when we were trying, because we were trying to create programs that worked for them, not trying to create programs that work for the city of Boston. And so the city of Boston at one point, the school department was very concerned about us. They said, you know, you guys are just very disloyal. You know, I said, well, no, we don't feel we're being disloyal. We feel like, you know, we're carrying forth the mission of the schools.
Yeah. Can you share a memorable story of when you realized there was a need for what you do for the community?
I think I just did when I talked about
the
community
languages.
school. Yeah. And then another one is because I mentioned that I'm also involved with the Chinese Historical Society. And that organization was started, I'm not a founder of that. I joined very early because there are folks in our community who noticed that Mount Hope Cemetery, which is in Mattapan, and is owned by the city, has a section for many of the earliest Chinese immigrants who came to this country. And that part of the cemetery was neglected. And they felt like there was a need. We need to do something. We cannot let these stones be overturned. We cannot let whatever monument that was there be toppled over and be deteriorating. And so that's why that organization was formed. But at the same time that we were focusing on that mission to try and fix up the cemetery and get the city to fix up the cemetery, we also realized that there were many early immigrants who were going into their 60s, 70s, and 80s. And we said, you know, if we don't get their stories, they're going to be gone. They will be lost. And so our second mission, besides the cemetery, was to gather these stories, gather the information about Chinese history in the New England area. And so that organization is still around, and it's just been fascinating how much stuff we've been able to learn. How many stories there are of Chinese who've participated in the civic life in New England and nobody knows about it. You know, one example would be a merchant who was very early in the Boston area, and he sold coffee and he sold tea, and was quite successful. He sold tea because, you know, of course, remember that the Boston Tea Party Americans said, you know, we don't want to pay taxes on the British tea. And they dumped it all in the harbor. Unfortunately, they still wanted to drink tea. So there was a tea trade that got set up. And so this person, Ong Ah Shou, was one of the tea merchants who ended up coming here. And he was very successful, and he ended up marrying an Irish-American woman from South Boston, and the two of them lived in Malden, Massachusetts. Mm-hmm. And because they were so successful, so wealthy, they actually sponsored the fireworks during one of their 4th of July celebrations. And nobody knows that. It's kind of like, oh, you know, this is interesting. The other thing we learned is that there is a Chinese person who was buried in the Boston Common burial ground. And this was in 1792. So of course people say, you know, they always think that Chinese new immigrants, that they just came here, they just got off the boat or got off the plane. And we said, well, you know, there's somebody buried, a Chinese person who's buried in the Boston Common burial grounds, not too far from your studio here. And that was in 1792. And the reason why he was here was, again, because of Chinese trade. Sadly, he had fallen off the mast of the ship and died. But his master thought highly enough of him that he erected a monument for him in the Boston Common burial ground. The first time that we went to look for the stone, we were looking for like the little small stones, and we looked high and low and couldn't find it. Until finally one day somebody was cleaning the stones, and we noticed it was actually a big monument, a big cemetery marker his master had erected for him. You know, and once in a while I will go there and I'll bring flowers, because I'm sure that when this person passed away, this young person, he was only 19 years old, I'm sure his family never knew what happened to them. You know, it's just, so I think that's true for many immigrants who've come to this country, whether they're Chinese or Haitian or Puerto Rican or Cuban, that they work so hard, and some of them give their lives and nobody knows about it. And a lot of times the families never know what happened to these people, because they didn't have the money to go back and tell the parents, the family, what happened. They came on their own.
Where's all this like information kept? Like when you gather stories?
Well, there is a
and
Chinese
stuff?
Historical Society,
Oh, okay.
okay? And so we keep a lot of that information there. We have a lot of photographs that we inherited from a newspaper, an American newspaper, that a Boston newspaper that has gone out of business. And we generate new stories, we generate new information. So we ask people, we want to interview them and get their stories and to get their photographs. So we try and scan their photographs and then we write a story about it.
That's cool. That like you do that. That's cool.
Yeah. Yeah, it's fun, and you learn a lot because you learn a lot not only about your community, but you learn a lot about the city of Boston. So you can't learn about people who are in the city without also learning about the city, and that's really cool. So I know a little bit about the city now too.
What are some obstacles that the AAPIs continue to face in Massachusetts and or the U.S.?
I'm not sure I can speak to that because I'm not in touch with all the Asian American communities. I know that one of them has been what people call the massing of data. So there are many different Asian American groups. That some of them have Chinese ancestry, some have Korean ancestry, some have Laotian ancestry, some have Cambodian ancestry, some have Vietnamese ancestry. And the needs of each of those groups is different. But when surveys are done, it's just like one category, Asian American. Mm-hmm. And so there have been one of the state senators who, or state representatives who tried to get enacted a bill that would disaggregate this information because the needs of each of these groups is different. And of course resources, having resources. I mean, I think that's probably true for every one of the groups, is resources. Having the resources to do the kind of work that needs to be done. And of course another one that would be generic would be having people who are trained. You need to have people in the pipeline who are willing to do this kind of civic work. And because the pay is not very high, I mean, most of my working in the community I just never got paid for it. Fortunately, I put my husband to work. You know, I said, all right, you go work, you get the health insurance, and I can do all this other stuff. So resources is one, and then having people. And for a while, I think in the 80s, there were several of us in the community who were really concerned about whether there were people entering the pipeline who were interested in doing community service kinds of work. And including some of my cousins who grew up in the suburbs. And I'm not sure I should say this, but there were a lot of people of that generation who were interested only in making as much money as they could, you know, and not so much interested in community stuff. I think that's changed a lot. You have to remember not to show this video to my cousins, okay? Because they're gonna kill me. But no, I think that they've changed. They're actually very good. But yeah, I think that now many colleges and universities kind of have encouraged the students to get involved with the neighboring communities, whether it's Chinatown, Dorchester, the South End, the North End, or even Medford, Somerville. And so I think that young people like your age are really interested in doing stuff in the community. And so I'm very heartened by that. I think that helps a lot. For the Asian American community, for those who are more closer to first or second generation, I think they may have a ways to go before they kind of get into that pipeline, because for a lot of first generation immigrants, those who come with their children, the first thing they want to do is they want to survive. They want to be able to make a living, and they want their children to not be working in a Chinese restaurant or working in a dry cleaner, or working in a nail salon. They have higher ambitions for them. So they don't care that they don't get that degree, but they definitely want their children to get the degree, and they want their children to be successful. And they also feel that if you go into the sciences or engineering, that there's a better chance that you will not be discriminated against, because the facts speak for themselves. But if you go into something like history, you know, they're going to say, well, you know, you got a little bit of an accent, maybe it's not a good idea for you to be hired as a professor. You know, and we've seen that in the past. So a lot of times parents will encourage their kids to become doctors or lawyers or scientists. But I think that there are a lot of, you know, young people who are not interested in those fields, and they do it because their parents kind of force them. I mean, I have a relative who got his law degree, and when he got it, the first thing he did with his little diploma, he gave it to his parents. He said, "Here, this for you. You guys wanted this. I don't want this. I want to go into film." So it's a dilemma that I think a lot of second and third generation people, young people, feel. So I think that it takes a while for that to change. So this first generation, they get their kids, you know, learning, and they'll become doctors. And so in that way, if you're a doctor, you can serve the community. But generally, if you're an artist, you know, Chinese families, it's like, artist, you're not going to be an artist. You never get any money. You know, they don't want that. They want that sense of security that would come with being a professional. So that's why there's so much emphasis on education in the Asian community.
What advice do you give to young people to be involved in like a public civic life?
To get involved with any organizations, just volunteer your time, and be tolerant. Give everybody the benefit of the doubt, you know, and just say, okay, maybe this didn't work. Maybe it was me. Maybe it was them. It doesn't matter. Let's try again. Let's do something else, and just stay positive, and try different things. You know, and just, you know, even though you're interested in film, go and try to do something different. You know, your career can change over your lifetime, and I think a lot of young people understand that, you know, even though you may start out as an accountant, you might decide halfway through, you know, like some sort of a track at your company that you want to do something else, that you want to be a nurse or you want to be a dentist or a filmmaker or an actor.
Do you find that a lack of funding hinders your ability to, well, when you were in the...
Yes, definitely lack of funding.
Your ability to accomplish goals in your organization?
Yes, yes.
And how did you manage that?
Well, we're still managing that.
Oh, okay.
I think some organizations, some human service organizations, have a tiny bit easier time. They still need to write